In this presentation, we're going to explore the concept of social exclusion. Most of the content of this presentation is based on Mel Walker's chapter, Social Exclusion, in Dwyer and Shaw's 2013 text, Introduction to Social Policy. Now, social exclusion is quite a slippery term because it's often used by political parties for particular purposes. The term social exclusion was coined in the 1970s to describe sections of the population that had fallen through the welfare net. This is very similar to the underclass discourse that emerged around the same time. However, although we have the term social exclusion, there are multiple nuanced definitions of what social exclusion means in detail, and we'll have a look at some of those as we progress through the presentation. When New Labour came to power in May 1997, the Blair administration founded the Social Exclusion Unit. This was a government quango charged with tackling social exclusion in UK society. The Social Exclusion Unit defined social exclusion as a shorthand label for what can happen when individuals or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems such as unemployment, poor skills, low incomes, poor housing, high crime environments, bad health and family breakdown. It was also acknowledged that the impact of social exclusion upon individuals and communities is greater than the sum of its parts. Hence, the elements of social exclusion are interconnected, multidimensional, mutually reinforcing and cumulative. Social exclusion affects both the quality of life for individuals and the equity and cohesion of society as a whole. And this is a point made by Levitas et al. In today's text, Walker, and Ruth Levitas writes extensively on the topic of social exclusion. And what the point being here is that although social exclusion is damaging for the individual, having a high proportion of individuals in a society that feel and are socially exclusion is also damaging for all members of that society. When New Labour came into power in 1997, it had spent a number of years redeveloping itself as a brand. The problem being that old Labour, the existing Labour Party, had failed to win elections since 1979. In Tony Blair's victory acceptance speech in the 1997 election, he made the very attractive point that he sought to see a Britain renewed with no one shut out or excluded and no one told that they do not matter. New Labour were also keen to establish that social exclusion was more than just traditional poverty. It is more damaging to individual esteem and corrosive for society as a whole, and it is more likely to be passed on down from generation to generation than material poverty. So says Jones, cited in Walker. Walker then goes on to explore in some detail the relationship between mental health and social exclusion, with each being mutually reinforcing upon the other. The closure of the Social Exclusion Unit took place in 2006, and the remit and size of the unit was reduced to the smaller Cabinet Task Force, with a brief to tackle intergenerational high-risk households, dysfunctional families whose problems were based in culture rather than poverty. And essentially what this meant is dealing with families who viewed the world in a particular way rather than who experienced the world with a certain set of material circumstances. These families were locked in a cycle of social exclusion, deviant families left behind the rising tide of affluence. So says Armstrong in Walker. Ruth Levitas, as stated, has written exclusively on social exclusion, and Levitas identifies three general discourses which are used to discuss the term social exclusion. The first of these is MUD, the moral underclass discourse, the second SID, the social integrationist discourse, and the third RED, the redistributionist discourse. So let's have a look at what those are in some detail. The first of these is the moral underclass discourse. Individuals or communities are seen as deviant, immoral, impulsive, welfare dependent, unhealthy, and criminal. And this sort of moral underclass discourse can be found in much of 2014's UK media, such as on popular TV and in the popular press. However, a critique of this view, the moral underclass discourse, is that perhaps it is serving a political purpose rather than actually a explanatory purpose. If you, for example, if you read the press or look at the TV, you would expect that this moral underclass was growing at an exponential rate and out of control. However, if we look into the facts, we can see actually the proportion of society that actually might fall into this category. Furthermore, the critique of the moral underclass discourse is that communities and individuals cannot be understood in isolation, and that their relationship counts to wider social groups and structures. And you can see a similarity in the poverty discourse when we discuss relative and absolute poverty. This idea is that poverty can only be understood relatively in more advanced societies, or more economically developed societies. For example, a person is only poor in relation to the person who is rich. The social integrationist discourse is the second discourse that Levitas identifies, and social exclusion results from exclusion from the paid labour market. Getting into paid work is seen to be the key, if not the dominant solution to wider social exclusion problems. And the SID discourse was central to New Labour's conditional welfare state, such as welfare to work, but you also might see parallels in the Every Child Matters agenda in terms of make a positive contribution and achieve economic well-being. And the idea here is that as well as enabling families and individuals to come off benefits, work brings more than just the benefit of a material wage in terms of self-esteem, social integration and contribution to society. However, a critique of this discourse is that all paid work is not the same. There are differences and in fact problems in the labour market. All work is not valued the same. A person doing job A might have much worse terms and conditions, job satisfaction, mental health and so on, than a person doing a different job, job B. Similarly, some kinds of work, such as informal and invisible caring for others, such as childcare and other family members, is not actually seen as work, but again can be rewarding in itself. Also, this social integrationist discourse has problems at explaining the growing numbers of people who are in work but are actually still poor, the working poor. The final discourse that Levitas identifies is the redistributionist discourse, and this is associated with the old Labour Party policies, and that poverty and structural inequality are the cause of social exclusion. The relationship between those with power and wealth who govern society and those who do not. Structural inequality is caused by powerful groups excluding others, often resulting in poverty. Hence, the powerful and wealthy have a vested interest in maintaining their wealth and power at the expense of the poor and socially excluded. You can't have one without the other. And within this redistributionist policy, the solution is for the state to intervene, to redistribute structural resources, and this is usually achieved through taxation. So in conclusion, we've had a look at what social exclusion might mean in more detail, but we've still highlighted that there are some problems with the term. It's a very general term, and it's often very difficult to pin down what is exactly meant. I hope you found that useful, and if you want more detail on the subject, a good place to start would be Mel Walker's text, Social Exclusion.